Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of the History of Medicine. If you'll recall, last week in class we talked about Ayurveda, and this week we're going to keep our focus on Indian medicine by tracing its growing presence in China during the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries of the Common Era. In talking about how different aspects of Indian medicine migrated into China at this time, we're going to learn about the field called translation studies and think about how this field helps us understand questions related to cross-cultural exchange in the history of medicine. Hence the title of this first lecture of the week, Translating Indian Medicine in Medieval China. One of the things we learned last week is that the emergence of Ayurveda coincided with an era of great cultural ferment in India, which developed into a major economic and political player during the early centuries of the Common Era. The age of the Gupta dynasty, which spanned the years 320 to 550 CE, is often labeled a golden age in Indian history. It was an age in which peoples all across Asia regarded Indian technological, artistic, and scientific knowledge as state-of-the-art, as without equal anywhere on the continent. As word of India's increasingly prosperous, militarily powerful, and culturally innovative civilization spread throughout the region, foreign observers became more and more interested in different aspects of Indian culture, many of which they imported into their own countries. Particularly true was this of China, which between the 3rd and 5th centuries CE entered into a period of political fragmentation, economic decline, and cultural disintegration. Open to the acceptance of novel ideas from abroad, China during this so-called period of disunity developed extensive cultural links with India. One outgrowth of this was the introduction of Buddhism, originally an Indian wisdom tradition, into China. Between 300 and 800 CE, China's rulers welcomed thousands of Buddhist missionaries into the country, and as Buddhist monks and scholars immigrated to China, they created temples and other institutions that provided different kinds of social services to the Chinese masses. In addition to distributing various types of charitable aid, these scholars actively proselytized their beliefs, encouraging Chinese men and women to adopt Buddhism. In the hopes of getting the Chinese population to accept Buddhist principles and practices, one of the things these missionaries did was translate hundreds of Buddhist texts into Chinese. And interestingly, many of these texts discussed subjects of a medical nature, including anatomy, physiology, embryology, diet, regimen, religious therapeutics, and general behaviors for maintaining one's health. As an example of this, consider the medical section of the Sui dynasty's imperial library, which listed the titles on the screen alongside Chinese medical classics. As texts like these began to accumulate within Chinese medical libraries, Chinese doctors began to incorporate certain Indian medical doctrines into their own systems of thought and practice. They also started using Indian drugs, prescriptions, and medical procedures. However, the process by which Indian medicine achieved inroads into China was not always a smooth one. Certain aspects of Indian thought were entirely alien to and in conflict with Chinese medical discourse. For example, while Chinese doctors believed that the natural state of humanity was one of health and harmony, Indian texts stated that illness was the default state for all unenlightened beings. These were quite contrasting philosophical principles, and this is just one of the many differences between the medical traditions of China and India. The fact that these were often not in agreement with each other raises an important question. How exactly were Buddhist ideas and practices incorporated into Chinese medicine? More specifically, to what extent did India's medical traditions change as they entered this new Chinese environment? And what explains these changes? In our attempt to address these questions, we're going to make use of a branch of social sciences and humanities research called translation studies. Translation studies is an academic discipline that examines the theory, practice, and phenomena of translation. It proceeds from the general observation that written and spoken translations play a critical role in human communication and is an incredibly helpful way of talking about processes of intercultural communication. As a conceptual tool, translation theory helps us better understand cultural difference and cross-cultural exchange. In particular, it helps us understand the complex creative act that is translating. Translation is commonly understood as a fairly simple, straightforward, passive act. Most people see it as a fairly mechanical process, one that entails nothing more than the transfer of a text written in one language, the source text, into an equivalent text in the second language, that is, the target text. Translation studies challenges this presumption. One of the most influential founders of modern translation theory was Eugene Nida, and the model of translation he developed in the 1960s, which is pictured here on the screen, presented this as a much more complex phenomena than hitherto believed to be. More than a mere medium of transfer, Nida conceived of translation as a mental meeting point where barriers of language and culture are crossed. Instead of taking translation for granted, he argued that it was complex. His model posits a series of intermittent steps between the source text and the target text. These are steps in which the translator analyzes the meaning of the text in its original cultural and linguistic milieu, and then considers the best way to transfer this meaning into the target language. Building bridges between these two languages is not easy, because each language has its own distinctive semantic world, complete with words, concepts, metaphors, symbols, ideas, and tropes that are unique to it. So, how to adapt foreign ideas so that they fit into the linguistic structures and cultural categories of the target language? Is it possible for a sentence to mean the same thing in its source and target contexts? What if certain ideas cannot be translated? If equivalence is not possible, what should be prioritized? Literal word-for-word renderings, or looser sense-for-sense translations that recreate the source text's social or cultural function in the new setting? As a discipline, translation studies has forced scholars to reconsider lots of things they once took for granted. If it is impossible for foreign language text to pass into our own language in a way that is pure and unmediated, then how should translation proceed? Should it be literal, or in other words, faithful to the original, or should it be freer? Does the answer to this question depend on the kind of text we're working with? Are there situations or genres of writing in which we should not prioritize a faithful rendering of the original? Would we value faithfulness more, for example, when dealing with a legal text compared to a poem or a speech? Consider an example. What if we had to translate the Italian sentence "Le piace molto la novella di Boccaccio" into English? The literal, most extremely faithful rendering of this would be, "To her pleases much the story of the Boccaccio." As you can see here, this is quite awkward. Would it be better to go with something different, such as, "She likes the story by the Boccaccio very much"? Or what if we went even further and said, "She's mad about the Boccaccio"? As this example suggests, the most successful translation is sometimes not the one that is the most literal and narrow. One of the fundamental insights of translation studies is that perfect one-to-one equivalence between verbal expressions in different languages is a logical abstraction. To the extent that equivalence exists, this has less to do with similarities between the source and text languages themselves, and more to do with the way that translators negotiate and compromise between two different sets of meanings. Thus, translation studies focuses on translators themselves and on questions about how translators craft their target texts. Scholars in this field do not ask about the accuracy or inaccuracy of translated texts. They don't talk about what the target text got wrong or about errors in translation. Instead of looking at how well the source text was translated, they're concerned with the things that influence translators' strategic crafting of their target texts. They talk about how translators repossess texts. They investigate the social and cultural logics that influence how and why translators dealt with the ideas they translate in particular ways and not others. A second key insight of modern translation studies is that translators have two basic strategies to employ when rendering a source text into a target text. These two strategies are called foreignizing and domesticating. In the first, translators try to use unfamiliar words that suggest a great deal of cultural distance between the source and target texts. In the second strategy, they use words familiar to those in the target language, and thus suggest that the foreign text is compatible with the target cultural linguistic system. With regard to any particular target text, then, we can ask, did the translator make use of foreignizing words, grammatical structures, and imagery, or domesticating ones? And what might have influenced their decision here? How do their translations reflect a desire to meet certain expectations, achieve certain rhetorical goals, or elicit a particular response from their intended audience? One of the biggest problems that translation studies encounters is the fact that it is often difficult to peer into the mind of the translator. While we can of course examine textual inputs and outputs and look at the larger systems texts are embedded in, we often can't say much about why translators made the decisions they did, or at least not definitively. This is even more true in history, because there's no chance of interviewing translators that have long since died. Studying historical instances of translation requires not only an understanding of the source and target texts, but also different cultural linguistic systems, the socio-political and ideological environment, relevant intellectual and economic stakes, and knowledge of the local situation, including the translator's goals and intended audience, the expectations of interpretive communities, etc. Again, it is about much more than the simple question of how accurate translators were in capturing ideas. What often looks like an error in translation is actually a translation tactic employed in the service of the translator's goals. Instead of reflecting confusion or mistaken understandings, so-called inaccurate translations often reflect conscious, strategic translation decisions. Thus, what we need to do is move beyond a limited focus on accuracy and toward one that explores the cultural resonances and social logics of translated texts. Okay, so consider this a primer in translation studies. As we get more into the topic, we're going to talk about how this field can help us understand the specific historical content we're covering this week. That is, the movement of Indian medicine across the cultural and linguistic boundaries of India and China. But before we get to this, I'd like to pose some general questions that will serve as a point of departure for our first discussion of the week. On the basis of what you've just heard, I'm interested in your response to the following. 1. What makes a good translation? Is there a best way of doing this? 2. With regard to medicine, specifically, what constitutes success in the translation of a particular theory or set of ideas? 3. How do medical ideas and practices travel? To what extent do local circumstances impact the meaning of medical texts as they cross cultural and linguistic boundaries? Once you've had a chance to think about these things, please share your thoughts, and we'll get this week's conversation going. I look forward to hearing from you.